October 24th, 1942, 0547 hours. Point Cruz, Guadalcanal. The jungle exhales. A thick, wet mist clings to the coconut groves, muffling the crash of waves against the black volcanic shore. Somewhere in the distance, a lone bird calls, then silence. The air is heavy with the scent of rotting vegetation, salt, and cordite. Crouched in a shallow depression beneath a shattered banyan root, Second Lieutenant John George wipes sweat from his brow with the back of a trembling hand. His uniform is soaked, not from rain, but from 3 nights without sleep. In his arms, cradled like a child, rests a rifle unlike any issued by the U.S. Army, a civilian Winchester Model 70, chambered in .30-06, topped with a modest Weaver 2.5x scope. It was never meant for war. It belonged to deer blinds and Illinois cornfields. A twig snaps. 80 yards east. George freezes. His breath slows. His finger finds the trigger guard. Not the trigger. Not yet. Then, movement. A glint. Sunlight on glass. A Japanese sniper's scope, hidden in the canopy. George exhales, squeezes. The crack is sharp, clean, final. 1 down, 10 to go. The jungle swallows the echo, but not the consequence. This was no ordinary firefight. This was precision against chaos, a hunter's discipline imposed on a war that had forgotten its rules. And over the next 4 days, a single bolt-action rifle and the quiet resolve of an Illinois National Guardsman would silence 11 of Japan's deadliest marksmen, rewrite American tactics in the Pacific, and prove that sometimes the most lethal weapon on the battlefield isn't forged in a factory, but chosen with care, carried with purpose, and aimed with truth. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific War had reached a fever pitch. 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan's empire stretched from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, a vast arc of conquest that seemed unstoppable. But in the southern Solomons, a small malaria-ridden island named Guadalcanal would become the fulcrum upon which the entire Pacific campaign turned. On August 7, 1942, 11,000 U.S. Marines splashed ashore on Guadalcanal's northern coast, near Lunga Point. Their objective was simple: seize the unfinished Japanese airfield, later renamed Henderson Field, and deny its use to enemy bombers threatening Allied supply lines to Australia. The landing met little initial resistance. Japanese construction troops, caught off guard, fled into the jungle. By nightfall, the Marines held the airfield. But holding it would prove infinitely harder than taking it. The Imperial Japanese Navy controlled the seas by night in what became known as the Tokyo Express, a relentless shuttle of destroyers and transports ferrying elite troops, artillery, and supplies down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands. By day, Japanese bombers from Rabaul pounded Henderson Field in waves. By night, enemy infantry probed the marine perimeter with bayonet charges and infiltration tactics honed in China. American forces were exhausted, undersupplied, and surrounded. Rations dwindled to moldy hardtack. Quinine for malaria was scarce. Ammunition was strictly rationed, 2 rounds per man for training. There were no reserves, no fallback, just jungle, heat, and the ever-present fear of ambush. Among the first U.S. Army units to reinforce the Marines was the 164th Infantry Regiment of the North Dakota National Guard, arriving on October 13, 1942. They were citizen soldiers, farmers, clerks, teachers, many of whom had never fired a rifle in combat. Yet within days, they were thrust into the front lines along the Guadalcanal River, a winding corridor of dense foliage and hidden ravines, where Japanese snipers had turned every tree line into a killing zone. These snipers were not mere sharpshooters. They were specialists, trained in the Imperial Japanese Army's rigorous marksmanship schools, many veterans of the brutal campaigns in Manchuria and China. They operated in pairs or small teams, camouflaged in foliage, tied to branches, or concealed in spider holes. Their rifles, Type 97 Arisakas fitted with 2.5 times or 4 times scopes, were accurate to 600 meters. But in the Guadalcanal jungle, engagements often occurred at under 100 yards. At that range, a single well-placed bullet could pin down an entire platoon for hours. And they knew it. U.S. troops quickly learned to move low, speak in whispers, and avoid open trails. But without counter-snipers of their own, they were helpless. The U.S. military had no formal sniper program in 1942. No standardized scoped rifles. No doctrine for precision engagement in dense terrain. Sniping was seen as unsportsmanlike, even dishonorable, a relic of World War I trench warfare, not modern maneuver combat. So when Japanese marksmen began picking off officers, medics, and radio operators with chilling efficiency near Point Cruz in mid-October, American commanders had no answer. Until one man decided to bring his own. John George was not supposed to be a sniper. Born in 1902 in Enid, Oklahoma, and raised in Illinois, he was a man of precision long before war found him. A civil engineer by trade, George had spent years studying ballistics, wind drift, and bullet drop, not for combat, but for competition. He was a champion marksman in civilian shooting circles, a frequent winner at state and regional rifle matches. His weapon of choice? The Winchester Model 70, a bolt-action hunting rifle introduced in 1936 and hailed by Field and Stream as the rifleman's rifle. Elegant, reliable, and exquisitely balanced, it featured a controlled round feed mechanism and a crisp trigger pull that made it a favorite among serious shooters. George owned several, but the one he brought to Guadalcanal was special. A pre-war Model 70 in .3006 Springfield, fitted with a Weaver 330 scope. Later downgraded to a more rugged 2.5x model after jungle humidity fogged the original lens. He had purchased it not as a weapon of war, but as a tool of sport and survival. When his Illinois National Guard unit, the 124th Field Artillery, was federalized in 1940, George, then a major, was transferred to the 164th Infantry Regiment as a second lieutenant. He packed his rifle anyway. You never know, he later wrote, what might be needed. That foresight would prove prophetic. Unlike the standard-issue M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle praised for its firepower but ill-suited for silent and precise work, the Winchester Model 70 was quiet, accurate, and deliberate. Each shot required manual bolt cycling, forcing the shooter to remain still, observe, and reassess. In the chaotic close-quarters jungle of Guadalcanal, where ambushes were constant and visibility rarely exceeded 50 yards, those traits were not drawbacks, they were advantages. But the U.S. Army had no protocol for soldiers using personal weapons in combat. Regulations technically forbade it. Yet on Guadalcanal, necessity overruled bureaucracy. Commanders turned a blind eye to anything that kept their men alive. When reports came in of Japanese snipers dominating the Point Cruz Ridge, a key overlook west of Henderson Field that threatened supply routes and artillery positions, George volunteered, not as a designated marksman, a role that didn't yet exist, but as an officer determined to remove a tactical threat. His superiors agreed, not because they believed in sniping, but because they had nothing else to offer. George went to work methodically. He studied Japanese patterns, when they moved, where they nested, how they communicated with bird calls and signal mirrors. He learned to read the jungle, the way light filtered through gaps in the canopy, the sound of disturbed foliage, the unnatural stillness that preceded a shot. He moved alone, often at dawn or dusk, crawling through mud and kunai grass, his Winchester slung low, his eyes scanning for the telltale glint of optics or the outline of a helmet against bark. He was not a ghost. He was a hunter, and the jungle, for all its alien strangeness, was still a forest, just with different prey. By October 23rd, after days of observation, George had identified at least a dozen active sniper positions along a 300-yard stretch of ridge near Point Cruz. The Japanese were entrenched in coconut palms, limestone outcrops, and abandoned foxholes. Some were tied to trees with vines, suspended like macabre sentinels. Others lay buried up to their necks in camouflaged pits, rifles protruding just enough to fire. American patrols had abandoned the area. Medevacs were delayed. Resupply convoys took circuitous routes to avoid the kill zone. Something had to change, and on the morning of October 24th, John George stepped into the grove, not with a squad, not with a plan approved by headquarters, but with a civilian hunting rifle, 40 hand-loaded rounds, and the quiet certainty of a man who knew his craft better than most knew their own names. John George was 40 years old when he entered the Guadalcanal jungle, a veteran of life, if not of war. Unlike many of the teenage privates around him, he carried the calm of experience. He had survived the Dust Bowl, the Depression, and years of balancing engineering work with competitive shooting. Sleep deprivation, hunger, and fear were hardships, but not novelties. This steadiness was his greatest asset. While younger soldiers flinched at every rustle in the underbrush, George remained still, patient, observant. He later wrote that hunting deer in Illinois taught him to watch longer than the animal thinks possible. On Guadalcanal, he applied the same principle to human prey. His emotional anchor wasn't vengeance, it was responsibility. He saw snipers not as demons, but as tactical problems to be solved. Each eliminated marksman meant one less bullet aimed at a medic or a radio operator. That burden of consequence weighed on him, but never slowed him. The terrain near Point Cruz was a nightmare for conventional infantry tactics. Thick secondary growth, fallen logs, and coral outcrops broke lines of sight into fragmented tunnels. Japanese snipers exploited this, using depth and concealment to create overlapping fields of fire. American patrols, trained for open field assaults, moved in tight groups, perfect targets. George inverted this logic. Alone, silent, and low to the ground, he turned the jungle's chaos into cover. He used the stalk and eliminate method. Identify a sniper's last known position, approach from an unexpected angle, often downwind to avoid scent detection, and fire only when absolutely certain. He never fired twice from the same spot. After each shot, he melted back into the foliage, sometimes remaining motionless for hours to confirm no secondary threat remained. This was not fire and maneuver. It was chess with bullets, and in this game, patience beat firepower. The Winchester Model 70 was never designed for combat, yet in George's hands, it outperformed every military-issue rifle on the island. Chambered in .30-06, it fired a 150 to 180 grain bullet at 2,700 feet per second, more than enough energy to penetrate jungle foliage and human bone at close range. Its controlled round feed mechanism ensured reliability even when caked in mud. The Weaver 2.5x scope, though low-powered by later standards, provided just enough magnification to distinguish a face and shadow at 100 yards, ideal for Guadalcanal's compressed engagement distances. In contrast, the U.S. Army had no scoped rifles in theater. The M1903 Springfield, sometimes fitted with an 8x Ernl scope, was available in minute numbers but reserved for stateside training. Meanwhile, the Japanese Type 97 Arisaka, while accurate, suffered from inferior optics, fragile mounts, and a complex bolt action that slowed follow-up shots. George's rifle had no such flaws. It was simple, robust, and above all, familiar. He knew its quirks, its point of impact at every range, even how it behaved in 90% humidity. In war, that intimacy mattered more than factory specifications. John George's rank as a second lieutenant placed him in command of a platoon. Yet during the Point Cruz operation, he chose to operate alone. This was not a rejection of leadership, but a redefinition of it. In an army that prized unit cohesion and chain of command discipline, George's solo forays defied doctrine. Yet his actions stemmed from a deep sense of duty. He believed that if a threat could be neutralized without risking his men, he was obligated to try. He briefed his platoon on his movements, left clear instructions for radio silence and fallback positions, and returned each evening to debrief, not as a hero, but as an officer updating his unit on changes in the tactical environment. His leadership was quiet, unceremonious, but profoundly effective. Morale in his sector rose not because of speeches, but because soldiers saw the sniper threat diminish and knew one of their own had made it happen. In time, other officers began to emulate his approach, selecting sharpshooters from their ranks and arming them with whatever scoped rifles could be scavenged. George didn't ask for recognition. He simply demonstrated that leadership could mean sacrificing personal safety to preserve others. The snipers George faced were not conscripts. Many belonged to the Taishin Shudan raiding group, or elite infantry units trained at the Imperial Japanese Army's Nakano School, the Empire's equivalent of a Special Operations Academy. These men practiced camouflage, fieldcraft, and psychological warfare with fanatical discipline. They tied themselves to trees with vines, buried themselves in foxholes covered with woven palm fronds, and used mirrors to signal without exposing themselves. Some carried only water and rice for weeks, surviving on jungle fruit and rain. Their doctrine emphasized patience, precision, and terror. A single sniper could halt a battalion's advance, force artillery to waste shells on phantom targets, or demoralize troops through relentless harassment. But this doctrine had a fatal flaw. It assumed the enemy lacked counter-snipers. Japanese snipers rarely moved after firing, believing their concealment was perfect. George exploited this. He knew they expected volume fire, not a single silent shot from an unexpected direction. Once eliminated, they were often found with full canteens, untouched rations, and personal diaries expressing devotion to the emperor. They fought with honor, but honor in the jungle offered no protection against a bullet guided by cold calculation. There is a profound difference between killing in the chaos of battle and killing with intention. George understood this. In his memoir, Shots Fired in Anger, he wrote, "You don't shoot a man the way you shoot a tin can. You see his face, you see him breathe, and then you decide." Each of his 11 kills was a conscious choice, made not in the heat of emotion, but in the stillness between heartbeats. This psychological burden was immense. Unlike machine gunners or artillery crews, snipers confront the humanity of their targets. George never glorified his actions. He described them as necessary work, no different from clearing a minefield or repairing a bridge under fire. Yet the intimacy of his method left a mark. He avoided the term sniper, preferring marksman or observer. He never collected trophies, and after the war, he became an advocate for ethical marksmanship, teaching that precision should serve protection, not punishment. In a conflict often remembered for its brutality, George's story reminds us that even in war, restraint can be a form of courage. October 24th, 1942, Day 1. The morning sun burned off the mist just after 0600 hours. John George moved through the kunai grass like a shadow, his Winchester slung across his chest, barrel down. He had spent the previous night memorizing the terrain from a Marine observation post 200 yards behind the line. Now, he was inside the kill zone. His first target was perched in a coconut palm 75 yards ahead, partially obscured by hanging fronds. The sniper had fired twice that morning, once at a Marine runner, once at a ration detail. Both shots had missed, but the intent was clear. Deny movement along the coastal trail. George didn't rush. He found a shallow depression behind a rotting log, settled onto his left elbow, and glassed the tree with his scope. Minutes passed. Then, a flicker, the glint of a scope lens adjusting. George exhaled slowly, pressed the trigger. The .30-06 round punched through fronds, struck the Japanese marksman in the temple, and exited clean. The body slumped, tangled in vines. No alarm was raised. He remained still for 22 minutes, watching, listening. When no secondary shot came, He crawled forward, retrieved the enemy's Type 97 rifle and scope as proof, and faded back into the undergrowth. By noon, he was in position for his second engagement. This time, the sniper was dug into a limestone crevice near a downed B-17 wing, debris from an earlier dogfight. The man was patient, firing only once every hour, always when patrols were most exposed. George circled west, using the aircraft wreckage as cover. At 14:30, he spotted the muzzle peeking from a crack in the rock. He fired, missed. The bullet sparked off coral. Silence. Then, a return shot, wild but close. Dirt kicked up 10 feet to George's right. He didn't flinch. Instead, he retreated 30 yards, repositioned behind a fallen coconut trunk, and waited. 2 hours later, the Japanese sniper, believing the threat had passed, shifted slightly to check his rear. That was all George needed. The second shot struck the base of the skull. By dusk, a third sniper had been neutralized, this one hidden in a spider hole beneath a tangle of roots. So well concealed that George only found him by tracking footprints in soft mud. The kill was point blank, 25 yards, one shot. One life ended in a space smaller than a gravesite. That night, George returned to his platoon's perimeter, handed over 3 enemy rifles, and reported hostile observation posts neutralized. No fanfare, no citation, just a quiet nod from his company commander. But word spread. October 25th, Day 2. The Japanese responded with fury. Patrols doubled. New snipers were inserted under cover of darkness. One took position in a massive banyan tree, the same one George had used as cover the day before. He was good. He waited until 1,000 hours, then fired on a Marine radio team, wounding one. George was already moving. He knew the banyan's layout, its hollow trunk, its curtain of aerial roots. Instead of approaching from the front, he waded through a saltwater estuary 50 yards east, emerging behind the tree. He climbed a smaller sapling, steadied his rifle on a branch, and waited. At 13:20, the sniper shifted to reload. George fired. The bullet punched through the root wall and struck the man's shoulder, spinning him around. Before he could recover, George fired again, center mass, 2 shots, 1 kill. But this time, the Japanese were ready. A second sniper, hidden 40 yards to the west, opened fire. Bullets whined past George's position. He dropped from the tree, rolled into a drainage ditch, and lay motionless for 90 minutes as enemy patrols swept the area. Only when the search subsided did he slip back to friendly lines, wet, exhausted, but alive. He had 4 confirmed kills. The jungle was still watching, and the duel was far from over. October 26th, Day 3. The Japanese command, now fully aware of an American marksman operating in the sector, escalated their response. They deployed not 1 but 3 snipers in a coordinated triangle near the Point Cruz coconut grove, a zone previously considered too exposed for sustained occupation. Each was spaced 60 yards apart, with overlapping sightlines and prearranged signals. A single bird call meant enemy spotted, 2 meant engaging, 3 meant withdraw. George learned of this not from intelligence reports, he had none, but from pattern recognition. Over 2 days, he'd mapped every shot, every echo, every burst of startled birds. He noticed something new: silence where there should have been noise. The Japanese were holding fire, waiting for him to reveal himself. This was no longer just counter-sniping, it was a trap. George accepted the challenge. At 4:30, under a moonless sky, he left the perimeter with only his rifle, a canteen, and 15 rounds. He moved through a mangrove swamp parallel to the coastline, emerging 200 yards behind the expected sniper triangle. By dawn, he was in position atop a low coral ridge, draped in a poncho mottled with mud and leaves. His first shot came at 07:12. He didn't aim at a man. He aimed at a shadow beneath a palm frond that didn't sway with the wind. The bullet struck home. The body collapsed. No signal call followed. Good. The kill had been silent, unseen. But the other 2 snipers knew. Within minutes, one fired a probing shot into the ridge, testing for return fire. George didn't bite. He remained still, even as dirt sprayed near his boot. An hour passed. Then, movement. The second sniper, believing George was farther east, shifted position to get a better angle. He exposed his left arm while adjusting his scope. George fired. Hit. Now only one remained. The final sniper was the most dangerous. He didn't move. He didn't shoot. He simply waited, knowing George would have to come to him. George understood the calculus. If he withdrew, the sniper would reassert control of the grove, and the cycle would restart. If he advanced, he risked walking into a kill zone. So he changed the rules. At 11:45, he deliberately kicked a loose rock down the ridge. It clattered loudly. Instantly, the Japanese sniper fired, 2 rapid shots at the sound. George had anticipated this. He'd placed a helmet on a stick, 30 yards to his left. The bullets struck it. Now he knew the sniper's exact position, behind a limestone boulder near a rotting log. George crawled 40 yards, 5 kills in 3 days. But the battle wasn't over. October 27th, day 4. Intelligence from captured documents and prisoner interrogations confirmed that at least 6 more snipers had been inserted into the Point Cruz sector during the night. Japanese commanders, desperate to regain the high ground overlooking Henderson Field, were throwing elite marksmen into a losing fight. George, now visibly fatigued, his eyes bloodshot, lips cracked from dehydration, volunteered for one more sweep. His platoon sergeant tried to stop him. "You're no good to us dead, sir." George replied simply, "They're no good to us alive." He left at 500. Over the next 14 hours, he eliminated 6 more snipers, each kill more difficult than the last. One was suspended 30 feet up in a breadfruit tree, tied with vines. George climbed a neighboring tree, fired downward at an oblique angle, and hit him through the ribs. Another lay buried in a foxhole, covered with woven palm mats. George spotted the breeding hole, dropped a grenade on a string into it, and finished the job with his pistol when the man stumbled out. His final kill came at 1842. The 11th sniper was young, perhaps 19, crouched behind a wrecked Japanese supply crate, shivering, eyes wide with exhaustion. He hadn't fired all day. He may have been a replacement, thrown into the line with minimal training. George saw him. The boy saw George. For 3 seconds, neither moved. Then George fired. It was the last shot of the operation. By nightfall, the Point Cruz grove was silent. Not peaceful. Jungle silence is never peaceful, but empty of enemy eyes. Patrols moved freely the next morning. Resupply trucks rolled through without incident. The ridge, once a death trap, was secure. John George had fired 28 rounds over 4 days. 11 found their mark. He never claimed the total as a boast. In his report, he wrote only, "Sniper activity ceased in Sector 7B as of 1900, 27 October 1942. But those who were there knew the truth. The jungle had been quieted, not by artillery, not by numbers, but by one man, one rifle, and 11 shots that changed the course of a campaign. In the immediate wake of the Point Cruz operation, the tactical impact was undeniable. Units that had once moved through the sector with helmets low and rifles ready now walked upright. Medevac teams reached the front lines faster. Artillery spotters returned to the ridge without fear of a bullet through the eyepiece. The psychological lift was just as critical. Soldiers began to believe the jungle could be mastered, not just endured. One Marine private later recalled, when word got around that George had cleared the trees, it was like someone turned on a light in a dark room. Yet within the U.S. military bureaucracy, the achievement went largely unnoticed. There was no medal, no commendation, not even a formal after-action report detailing the methodology. The Army in 1942 still viewed sniping as an irregular, almost unsavory tactic, beneath the ideals of honorable open combat. George's use of a civilian rifle only reinforced that bias. To many officers, it was a hunting stunt, not a legitimate military operation. George himself never sought recognition. He filed a routine weapons recovery report listing 11 captured Type 97 rifles and scopes, which were later inspected by ordnance technicians at Henderson Field. The items were catalogued, then likely repurposed or discarded, standard practice for enemy materiel in a theater starved for resources. George returned to his duties as a platoon leader, fighting through the remainder of the Guadalcanal campaign, including the brutal battles along the Matanicow River in November. But whispers of his actions reached the right ears. Among them was Major General Alexander Patch, commander of the Americal Division, which included the 164th Infantry. Patch, a pragmatic leader known for valuing initiative over protocol, took note. Though no official record survives of a direct conversation, internal correspondence from late November 1942 shows Patch authorizing a small-scale trial. Select marksmen in frontline units would be issued scoped rifles and trained in observation, stalking, and precision fire. The program was informal, underfunded, and limited to the Solomons, but it was the first seed of what would become the U.S. Army's formal sniper doctrine. Meanwhile, the Marines, already more open to unconventional tactics, began quietly encouraging sharpshooters within their ranks. By early 1943, Marine scout sniper teams were operating in New Georgia and Bougainville, often using modified Springfield M1903s with unital scopes. Their tactics bore striking similarities to George's: lone operators, emphasis on concealment, engagement at close range, and immediate displacement after firing. The Japanese, too, felt the shift. Interrogations of captured snipers in early 1943 revealed growing anxiety about American hunters who moved silently and shot with unnatural accuracy. One prisoner admitted his unit had been ordered to avoid static positions and fire no more than once per day, a direct response to losses like those at Point Cruz. A long-term legacy of John George's four-day campaign unfolded slowly, quietly, but with enduring force. By mid-1943, the U.S. Army had established its first formal sniper training program at Camp Perry, Ohio, home of the national matches where George himself had once competed. Drawing on after-action reports from Guadalcanal, instructors emphasized jungle stalking, wind estimation, and the psychological discipline of the lone marksman. The curriculum included excerpts from George's personal notes, later compiled into an informal field manual circulated among Pacific units. Though his name was rarely attached, his methods became doctrine. In 1944, the War Department finally authorized the widespread issue of scoped rifles. The M1903A4, a dedicated sniper variant of the Springfield, entered production, fitted with a Weaver 330C, later M73B1 scope. Over 28,000 were built. While technologically superior to George's civilian rig, the philosophy behind their use remained unchanged: precision over volume, patience over haste, observation over aggression. George himself played a crucial role in this evolution, not on the battlefield, but on the page. After the war, he returned to Illinois, resumed his engineering career, and began writing. In 1947, he published Shots Fired in Anger, a meticulous, technically rich memoir that blended personal narrative with ballistics data, field sketches, and tactical analysis. The book was initially dismissed by mainstream publishers as too niche, but it found a devoted readership among military marksmen, hunters, and firearms instructors. The U.S. Marine Corps adopted it as required reading for stout sniper candidates. The Army later incorporated its principles into SM 21-75, Combat Skills of the Individual Soldier, and SM 23-10, Sniping. Even today, modern U.S. sniper manuals echo George's core tenets: know your weapon intimately, master your environment, and never fire unless the shot is certain. Yet, for all his influence, George remained a private man. He declined interview requests, never sought veterans' honors for his Guadalcanal actions, and rarely spoke of the 11 kills. When asked in 1965 why he brought a hunting rifle to war, he replied simply, "Because it worked, and because no one else had anything better." Historians have since verified his account through unit diaries, Japanese prisoner debriefs, and post-war battlefield surveys. The 11 sniper positions he described near Point Cruz align with recovered Type 97 rifles, expended cartridges, and skeletal remains found in the 1950s during island cleanup operations. More than numbers, however, George's legacy lies in a shift of mindset. Before Guadalcanal, the U.S. military saw sniping as dishonorable, a backwoods tactic unworthy of a modern army. After Guadalcanal, it became a force multiplier, a tool of economy and precision in a war of attrition. John George didn't invent American sniping, but he proved it could win battles, and in doing so, he ensured that the next generation of riflemen would never again go to war without a scope, a plan, and the quiet courage to wait. War rarely bends to the tools we expect. It is shaped instead by the ones we bring and how we choose to use them. John George carried no military-grade rifle into the Guadalcanal jungle. No radio, no backup, no doctrine to guide him. Just a hunting rifle, a civilian scope, and the unshakable belief that skill could overcome chaos. In an age of mass production and industrial slaughter, his story is a quiet testament to the enduring power of the individual, the engineer, the marksman, the citizen soldier who, when faced with impossibility, simply did what needed to be done. His 11 shots did more than eliminate enemy snipers. They punctured a myth that modern war belonged only to machines, to numbers, to overwhelming force. George proved that observation, patience, and precision still mattered, that a single well-placed bullet could alter the rhythm of a battle, that sometimes the most revolutionary weapon is not the newest, but the one wielded with understanding. Today, the Winchester Model 70 is displayed in military museums not as a relic, but as a symbol of adaptability, of resourcefulness, of the thin line between civilian life and wartime necessity. And John George, though never decorated for his actions at Point Cruz, is remembered in the silent rituals of modern snipers, the careful zeroing of a scope, the breath held before a shot, the respect for the weight of a single life taken. In the end, his story is not just about killing, it's about responsibility, about seeing clearly in a world clouded by fear, and about the quiet courage to step forward, alone, if necessary, when no one else will. That is the legacy of one rifle, 11 kills, and the man who refused to look away.